Hello and welcome to another Sprues and Brews interview. Today we are talking to Leo from Parabellum Games about Conquest, the last argument of kings. How are you doing today?
I'm very good. How about yourself? Thank you for
Yeah,
inviting me. We've been rescheduling for a while now. I was sick and we had to go back and forth, but thank you. Finally, we managed to meet to have the interview.
no, it's been really good. We've been really keen to do this because, as some of you may or may not know, watching this, Conquest is a ranked battle game, and that's really cool because there's not many of them kicking around anymore. So yeah, what we're going to do is talk about Conquest, talk about some of the cool new things that have either just come out or coming out on the horizon, and just a chat about the game in general. So before we kick off then and dive into the world of Conquest, can you tell us a little bit about who you are and what Parabellum Games do?
So I am Leandros Mavrokefalos, or Leo. A lot easier to say and pronounce. I am right now working for anything that has to do with game development for Parabellum Games. I started back in the day when we were first before actually even starting out the company as a playtester, and then I moved on to community manager, and then I moved on to overseeing a lot of our product development when it comes to rules, when it comes to other accessories and so on. So now doing this for the company.
Oh, that's really exciting. And so, what do Parabellum do? Is it kind of a miniatures kind of rules up front, or kind of miniatures that you kind of focus on mostly?
So Parabellum Games is a war game designer and manufacturer of its miniatures. So our two flagship games are Conquest: The Last Argument of Kings, which is a mass battle rank and file war game, and our second game, which share the same miniatures, is Conquest: First Blood. Both of these games actually launched with their second edition, Last Argument of Kings, a few 2 or 3 months ago, and First Blood, it's been out second edition for about 6 months. We create fantasy miniatures that go with these two games, along with all the other products that and accessories that are useful for you to use in your TLOK and First Blood games.
Amazing, cool. So, I guess that takes us straight to Conquest: The Last Argument of Kings. So, what can you tell us about it? How does it bring kind of fantasy
Mhm.
mass ranked battles to the tabletop?
So, Last Argument of Kings is indeed a rank and file mass battle war game. The main difference is though that we took the usual paradigms of the rank and file and the regimental sort of combat and modernized and brought it essentially to modern day
Hmm.
gaming standards. To do this, essentially, when you play a game of Last Argument of Kings, there's no deployment. Everything walks onto the table based on whether it's light, medium, or heavy. As it does that, it pushes forward a reinforcement line. Think of it a little bit like a line of scrimmage,
Hmm.
right? And as you push forward, then your reinforcements can come onto the table further on and further on. And what that creates is an asymmetrical, always changing battlefield, right? On which regiments can come in from either flank, and there's this constant shift in power on the battlefield. But what's most important is that we completely forego of the I play everything and then you play everything sort of
Hmm.
game system. Instead, what we do, every regiment that is on the battlefield or that is about to enter the battlefield has a command card associated with its type, with its essentially with the kind of regiment that it is. At the very beginning of the game, what we do is that we take these command cards and we pre-arrange them in the order that we want into a command stack, essentially locking in all of the activations and the order in which these activations will happen throughout the game for that round. So once that is locked in, I get to draw a card, activate my one regiment, and then you activate a card, and then you activate your regiment. So there is this whole there is a sense of fog of war, let's say, where you have to decide on how you're going to play your regiments throughout the game, but at the same time, you need to think of what your opponent will be doing in between.
That's interesting. That because obviously in a lot of other games, you often say that you've lost the game at deployment because certain armies can maybe do everything turn one. With the back and forth and the random order of units coming on, I guess there's quite a bit of strategy to even building your army because you can have multiple units maybe with the same command card to give yourself a bit more flexibility maybe in what units you activate perhaps.
A big decision, and this is something that we've been honing for a while now. the way the game plays. So conceptually, there is a loosely defined, let's say, planning and execution phase in terms of the game. So we try to uh, be very cognizant of where most of the thinking happens, right?
Mm.
So there's a lot of the thinking during the command phase, right, which is the phase in which we make our command stack, and then when you start playing and activating, you break down your thinking into more manageable chunks, right? By just now I have to play this one regiment, what it is that I will have to do, and what are the ways in which I will react to my opponent's moves. That makes it a lot more a lot easier of an experience when it comes to tournaments. You can play a lot more games right. The game runs a lot faster as well because
Mm.
it doesn't have deployment. It just helps you split your brain power essentially throughout the game
Yeah.
a lot better, rather than have to go through huge periods of times of having to think how your entire army will move and then wait helplessly as you're being alpha strike to death.
Yeah.
That can happen, but this way it's important that you're always going to fight and hit somewhere. You're going to hit hard somewhere, and that you're going to get hit hard somewhere else, right? So you, there's merit into always playing a battle down to the very last regiment,
Mm.
down to the very last point, and you always get to play. You always get to do something. You can never just lose outright.
Yeah, there's always the chance you can turn things around because you're not getting, like you say, hit by every unit. There is always something to do. So that's really, really cool. So, Conquest originally launched with a box set containing the Spires and the
Yes.
Hundred Kingdoms, but you've loads more factions added in the lore and 7 or 8 playable factions, 7 with the city states now playable factions, haven't you? Um,
That's right. Yeah.
so can you tell us kind of how the kind of the
Mhm.
lore and the different factions kind of grew over time, and any kind of thought into kind of why those races were introduced?
Yeah, so certainly, so the core set now that released back in August 2019. It's been a while, hasn't
Time
it? Hasn't
flies.
it?
Wow. Okay.
Time flies, yeah. So the first two factions now presented essentially the human faction, right? And the human, it's important to have a human faction in the game because this is usually the way through which narratively um, we are, as readers of the lore, are
Mm,
capable of seeing that world, right? Usually we need something that we can identify to in order to be able through that to understand the intricacies of that world.
mm,
And the Spires, which was a second faction, now, that faction was very alien in the sense that the way that they were thinking really did not work. You couldn't really explain in terms of human psychology, right? So
yeah.
you needed the Hundred Kingdoms, a human faction, to be the mirror upon which some of those traits would reflect, and we would be able to read and understand them. So, for example, there is this collection of short stories. It's called Nepenthe. They're available for free online for people to read them if they want to. And essentially, it talks about the story of Rismark and Frederick and how they saw and interacted with the spires for the very first time. And it's very important to have the human faction there, to be able to live the horror of having to deal with the spires. You know,
Yeah.
through seeing
Yeah.
another person doing it. Then we went on with the Nords and the Dwegom as the third, and as the Dwegom were the third faction,
Mm,
Nords were the fourth. Now the Dwegom were introduced because they have such a strong connection to war, to the primordial essence of war, that allowed us to explain essentially, first of all, to start tapping into the story of the primordials, to the genesis of the world, to explain a little bit what war is and how war is actually a tangible thing, right? It's an
mm.
entity along with creation, destruction, famine. Then we had the Nords, which is unlike what would most expect. Uh, there are humans, but a human faction per se,
Hmm.
right? So narratively, the Nords allowed us to explain the journey of the spires. It doesn't. It sounds a little, it sounds a little odd, but essentially, by introducing the Nords next, we discussed about why the spires came to this world. They were
Mm.
exiled from their own world. They were hunted, right? And so they came to a. They wanted to and reclaim their world, and
Hmm.
to do that, they needed resources and they needed an army. So the first ones that they tried to experiment on, right, was the local fauna, let's say, right, and those were the
Yeah.
humans. But the story of the Nords is a story of, essentially, it explains the unique combination of elements that makes a human. It explains a little bit indirectly how the Spire's biomancy and ferromancy work and why it didn't really work with humans. And then there is a story of survival and on how those humans tamed the horrors of Mannheim, and also what the horrors of Mannheim actually are. Right.
Hmm.
Moving on from them, we went to the Wadrun. The Wadrun were a very interesting race, and essentially discuss. They are the byproduct and essentially the culmination of the conflict of the elder races between the Dwegom and the Spires,
Hmm.
right? So the Wadrun were developed and they were released as a last resort against the Dwegom after the Dwegom were they managed to destroy not one but two actual spires, which was destroying one was considered to be impossible, but
Yeah.
they essentially unleashed themselves upon the spires to destroy two. And so we start further discussing about what is the we were able to discover the world of conquest in Ea from the eyes of a brand new civilization, and
Hmm.
how is that a civilization that just came to life is now seeing this world for the very first time. What does it mean to be a new faction and a new culture in that world? Like how does we the humans, allows us to see into the world of conquest, but these humans were already acclimated to Ea.
Yeah.
Now we have this new faction that is brand new, never had, knows nothing, and so you're gonna have to rediscover their world, some
Hmm.
of the interesting intricacies of Ea through their eyes. At that point, the main story arcs, a lot of the main story arcs were completed. Like, we discussed a lot of things. So what we try to do, and this is something that we always want to do, is that we want to involve the community in the
Mm.
future of the game. So back then, we launched what we called Project 6. And Project 6, essentially, we called players to join our living world. This is our narrative campaign voting medium, right? Through which players had to vote between the Old Dominion, the city states at the time, and the Weavers on which one would be the next faction.
Mm.
So people voted the Old Dominion, and that allowed us to delve further deeper into the story of Haslia, into the stories of the Fall, into what was the Old Dominion, what used to be, what the intricacies of why it fell, and why did the humans decided that they have to go against their god, which at that point was a good god.
Yeah.
And then right after the Old Dominion, seeing the fact that they were neck to neck with the city states, even though was it, the plan was not to release those three factions necessarily. We would only release the one that got
Mm.
voted out, right? We saw so much engagement when it comes to city states, and of course, being Greeks ourselves, we were a little more inclined to
Yeah.
tap into that, and that that is allowed us to see what happened to the descendants of the Old Dominion, to
Hmm.
explore that story arc. So the Old Dominion fell after trying to destroy Haslia. What happened to those that survived? What happened to those that were trying to recreate the old Dominion with these ideas of creating uh, benevolent philosopher kings, and what really happened, right? What they did with all that knowledge they got
Mm.
from the old Dominion, which is where we are today at the in lore. And
Awesome.
recently, we did another project where it's called Project 8,
Hmm.
where people once again had the opportunity to vote on the next faction, this time between the Sorcerer Kings, the Dogs of War, and Hell, right? And with the Sorcerer Kings and Hell being so close, there were points that we had like 0 point something percent difference
Really?
between. Yeah, yeah. And it was insane because we had the metrics where we had 10 or 11 times more engagement that we have with Project 6. And it's
Mm.
just also very, very important, like how much our audience grew as well, how much the community grew as well.
Do you think the fact that you engage the fans so much in kind of shaping the future of the game, do you think that helps kind of, I guess, draw players to the game because people, oh yeah, I voted that faction, I want to see them be the next force in the game.
For sure, because it's not just the kind of choices that we provide players is not just, oh, which one is the next faction, which is a great, right? It's a big decision, and we stick to it. The way the living world works is that every 2 weeks there are these narratives that are moving on, right? Characters, figures from each faction. There is a journey that they undertake or an adventure they go through, and through their eyes, people learn more about the world of Ea. But what happens is that oftentimes there are characters that have some choices, right? They have a dilemma. They have to choose between go over one way or the other.
Mhm.
Or we have like the narrative arc, the story of Alecaneros, the Duegom that lost all of his Agum, and now he is challenging the philosophy of the Duegom and the Agum system and how all that works, right?
Mm.
So these characters, though, often find themselves in a position in which decisions need to be made, and these decisions we let players vote, right? So people get to shape not just big decisions like which one's going to be the next faction, but people they personally identify with, and figures they really like to shape some of the future, perhaps,
Mm.
of their faction. Because one of the things we were always very clear with our lore is that nobody is wearing plot armor. If
Yeah.
someone is destined to go, they're gonna go, right?
Yeah,
And off and yeah.
I guess it's like Game of Thrones, isn't it? Where nobody's safe, and if a major character can die, that happens, and the plot advances with that happening.
Yeah, if there is no death of a major character for no reason, just for them
Mm.
to go, right? But sometimes this is what happens, and that world, the world of Conquest, is filled with turmoil. There's a lot of conflict and there's a lot of developments, and we want to make sure that it is literally a living world. It progresses, and that will become more and more apparent as we move on with the project.
That's really cool. I like the fact that the universe evolves and things change, and like you say, actions have repercussions, and yeah, that's something we haven't really seen in other games. So it's quite exciting to see that happen. So you mentioned the city states; they're the
Mhm.
newest faction in the game.
Yes.
What's their playstyle, and what can players and collectors look forward to in the range?
So the city states encapsulate this Hellenistic era aesthetic, right, from the Macedonian Wars
Mm.
to the Persian Wars to Alexander the Great, all the way to Sparta and so on, the Hellenistic Athens and so on. So what they bring to the table is that actually, as a faction, I would say, and this is something that is core to our game design, is that it's often, what a faction does is often not as characteristic as what a faction cannot do,
Yeah.
right? So for example, the city states, they don't have a lot of shooting, they don't have a lot of fast cavalry troops, but what they do
Mm.
have is one of the most efficient infantry formation game style in the game, right? They're not. It's not about high stats. It's not about particularly high march values, but it's the tactics that they use and the tactics that allow you, the player, to employ that makes them one of the most efficient infantry forces. So, for example, they're bringing two important faction special rules into the game. The first one is called the strategic stack, right? So far we have the command stack where we arrange our command cards and then we draw right to activate our regiments.
Mm.
But what you can do is that you can draw a card, right, and say, I'm not going to activate it now. I'm going to put it face down in my strategic stack. And then it's back to you, and you can play your next card. When it's my turn again throughout the round, I can draw a command card from my command stack and say, okay, I will activate this card. And once I'm done with this regiment, I will also activate the card from my strategic stack.
Mm.
So it allows you to forfeit an activation throughout your round in order for you to be able to perform two activation one after the other at some point during the round. What that means is that you can stagger a little bit. Sometimes your opponent expects you to play a certain way, and suddenly when you don't make that move, that's a big initiative advantage that you can take.
Yeah.
Sometimes there is this there are all these maneuvers that you can do. You can have one regiment withdraw, so to open up space for another to go back in and charge.
Mm.
There are all these combinations that you can do that is extremely important. And then the other very cool faction rule that they have is called auxiliary stance. So what that means is that to delve a little bit deeper into the lore of the city states, right? They're they're not just humans. They have the bread, which we're talking about satyrs, minotaurs,
Mm-hmm.
etc. They're part of their society, but they're also part of their armed forces. They're regularly trained, and they all fight. They fight together, which means that oftentimes it's very common to see a minotaur hospist or a minotaur therian fighting alongside the hoplites.
Mm.
So as you have your hoplite formation, suddenly there is a big minotaur holding a huge shield, fighting there. That definitely boosts morale and definitely helps you get some of the tougher, encounters, get through some of the tougher encounters. And so what you can do is that for your regiments of Phalagites, Thorakites, or hoplites, you can actually include in there a stand of a minotaur. So you do mixed regiments, right? To help you boost the efficiency either towards the defensive side if you have a Minotaur with a shield, or towards the offensive side if you have the Minotaur with a 200 weapon.
Cool. That's really cool from a visual point of view as well. You kind of
Yeah.
block of hoplites marching forward with a minotaur in their ranks. Yeah, that appeals.
Yeah. And then so, n- after that, we have mighty spellcasting giants. We have the Festian and the Promethean giants. They tap a little bit into um, the concept of resonance. The myth of the story of how the ancient Greek philosopher discovered the concept of frequency, right? When they were
Mm.
hearing the four blacksmiths in the market hitting, iron, and they were able to correlate the weight of the hammer and the material to the pitch that it created.
Yeah.
And so we have the Pythagoras, concept of heavenly ratios and so on. And so we play their magic plays into that and plays
Okay.
into these concepts, into the history of frequency and resonance. Essentially,
That's cool.
we tie, yeah, we go into and tie mythology and history and all the in between mixes
Yeah.
in the lore, but also it's very important for us to reflect that lore into gameplay.
Yeah, that captures the feeling of the faction then, doesn't it, within the
Mm.
playable army? And that's really cool.
Yeah.
So alongside the city
Mhm.
states, just recently, the new two-player starter set came out, which had the city states and the Nords in it. What do you get in the box, and do you think it's a good kind of jumping on point for people who may be interested in playing Conquest?
Oh yeah, yeah. That's actually I am like, it's funny. I'll tell you this just for you to get it right. So we have our one player starter boxes, right?
Hmm.
Right, and so they're a certain size. So of course, we're gonna have to make a bigger box for the two-player set, and that's fine. So we make the bigger set, right? And so we start realizing that all the things that we put in there wouldn't fit. So we have
Right.
to make it. We had to make an even bigger set, right? Just for you to start getting a little bit, the idea of like how many things are in there.
Yeah.
So exactly like you said, we have the city states and the Nords, and in there you're going to find a character and three regiments per side. So that is, you have the Nord King and the city states Polemarch. Now you're going to find their alternative poses, so even if you've already grabbed your if you already have a Polemarch or you already like that model, you're going to get an alternative sculpt,
Hmm.
right? So in for the city state side, you get a regiment of Phalangites, a regiment of hoplites. Now these are dual kits, right? So you can build either or. You can either have two Phalangites or two hoplites. You can choose, and then you have a regiment of three Minotaurs, which can be built either as Minotaur Therians or as Minotaur Haspists.
Hmm.
Haspists are the one with the shield. Therians are the ones with a 200 weapon. The Nord side has a regiment of Huskarls. It has a regiment of plastic bow chosen. Now, for the veteran players, would remember that our initial release of the bow chosen were in resin,
Hmm.
right? Because and each and every model in there was like a separate character
Yeah.
in terms of quality. But we were able, like we promised, we turned these into plastic and we reduced the
Awesome.
price. They remain still the same kind of detail, and then we also have a mountain Jotnari there. So we're talking about for you get in a two-player set overall six regiments, two characters, actually two rulebooks, right? Because we were discussing about this, and it's like, what's the point of only having one if two players are going to buy it?
Yeah, that's
So,
a great thing. So often people buy these starter boxes
yeah,
and have to share the
yeah.
rule book, so having one each is awesome. And
No,
like you
no,
say, I
two
guess with a lot of the
rulebooks.
kits having dual builds as well, there's potentially room there for getting multiples of these box to build a big force for both of these armies.
Oh, for both the Nords. So the Nords have would have a little bit of a harder time because of you can have one king per
Hmm.
army, but the regiments you get in there can actually be duplicated to great effect.
Okay.
So there's a lot of merit into adding them to your side and into your collection. The city states for sure you can go for two, right? And I would even say you can go for three in the sense that you have. I mean, if you get two, you're going to have a six stance of Phalagitis and six stance of hoplites. That's actually very reasonable, and
Hmm.
you would probably need more in terms as they make the bulk of your front lines, right? And then the two regiments of Minotaurs are great. They allow you to have one regiment and then split the others as auxiliary stands. It allows you to have or two regiments of three, two polemarks that you can absolutely use. So that's great value in there as well.
Awesome. That's really cool. So like you say, the
Yeah.
new rule book is in that box. What
Yes.
tweaks have there been since I think you had a 1.5 edition not so long ago.
So it's. I will tell you this. So for a like on paper, a lot of things changed,
Hmm.
but the conquest experience has not changed at all.
Yeah.
It's one of the softest landing, like I think, addition changes that you can. So if first of all, there's a lot of quality of life updates. There were a lot of FAQs. There were a lot of questions that people asked us, right? That we included into update 2.0. But the biggest change, uh, the single biggest change, is the fact that update 1.5.1 and before, right, had the focus of the character profiles going onto the model,
Hmm.
right? So, for example, you will be building your list and you would have, let's say, men at arms, right? In the characteristic profile would say one attack, one wound, you know, something like let's say if you had a regiment that could shoot it would be bar as one, right? So you would take these stats and you would multiply them by the amount of models on the stand, and you would figure out how many attacks or how many wounds or how many shots you have per stand.
Yeah.
Very quickly, however, as we started growing and we started updating and balancing, this created a problem that we essentially there were things that we could only go up or down in increments of four.
Yeah.
So if we gave men at arms another attack, then that meant that each stand would do eight attacks, right? Which
Yeah.
was way too many. And we had that problem, for example, with Dragon Slayers. Like Dragon Slayers having four wounds just didn't work, but then having eight were way too many.
Yeah.
So update 2.0, what we did is that we shifted the focus from the model to the actual stand.
Hmm.
So now we can ask ourselves questions like, wait, I have four Wadrun, right? And then I have four militia. Isn't it reasonable that four Wadrun would do more attacks than four militia? Or would it be reasonable to say that four Wadrun could take more punishment than four
Yeah.
militia? So, for example, then some regiments could don't really need to have four wounds. Now they can have five or six. For example, Vanguard clones, right, would have eight attacks per stand. That was a little bit more than we needed them, but also four attacks didn't really reflect how they fought in the lore. So
Yeah.
now they have six.
Yeah. You have more kind of gradient between the
Mhm.
units. Then that's cool. So I guess for old
Mhm.
players, is there much that they'd need to learn different? Or is it lots of small tweaks, maybe?
So I wouldn't say. In essentially, you now simply have to think on a per stand basis.
Hmm.
The change, for example, healing. Now you have to be able to heal at least half of the stand's wounds rounded up in order to bring it back.
Okay.
So all the underlying rules and systems are there. It's the exact same, like it's the exact same game with an engine that works better, essentially.
Cool.
The piece of advice I would give to veteran players, however, is a lot of players, because now you don't have to remove model per model from each stand to denote casualties. Essentially, some people are thinking, let's say, that they could glue the models on the stand.
Hmm.
And I would suggest for to veteran players, I would actually suggest to not do this. And the reason is that one of the reasons why we have the circular bases into the stands, apart from the fact, of course, that there is a beautiful second game, skirmish First Blood, is also because they can rotate, and by rotate on the spot, they actually rank up better.
Yeah.
And what happens is that even your regiment may rank up beautifully within itself, but when you engage two enemy regiments, it will rarely be flush.
Yeah.
So it's very important to be able to rotate your models so they fit with the models with the opponent's models, so you don't damage your miniatures or yours don't get damaged, right?
Yeah.
Things are not wonky, right? So everything fits flush and nice. And of course, command stance, you may be choosing your officers and so on, so it's better to magnetize, because you might be one game you might have an officer and the other game you might just not want to pay the points for it. Or
Yeah.
the character stands might have retinues, but then for your next game to not buy retinues, right? So it's important to be able to take the models out.
Yeah. Gives you lots of kind of options on how to put the units together. No, that makes sense.
Exactly. Yeah. But the round based on the square stand is a big quality of life little feature there. Just by being able to rotate things right and fit flush, just makes things a lot easier.
We've all been there when you're trying to
Yeah.
position two units together and there's spears and shields in the way, and
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, no, that's
or
cool.
or even or even worst case scenario, right? Or worst case scenario, if you cannot do them, being able to take the model off if it's
Yeah.
really no right. Sometimes you just don't want to damage your models or your opponent's models, right? So it's better to have the option to make it work as easy as possible rather than to glue everything in place, right, and not being able and suddenly lose all of the advantages of having the round
Yeah,
base.
exactly. And I guess for storage point of view as well, it's probably easier to store those individual models rather than you're fixed to a stand. Yeah, depending on your storage solution. I mean, speaking of the models, I
Hmm.
guess the detail of Conquest miniatures kind of grown over the years with some really cool kits coming out. Has the way you've approached kits changed? Is there anything that you're kind of looking to do in the future that maybe kind of fans haven't seen yet?
So definitely, first of all, right off the bat, players that have been with us since the beginning. I mean, even players that picked up Conquest later on would see, that the an insane growth in quality.
Mm,
Like for example, when you go back from our original starter set, still models that we absolutely love, but going into um, later on kits. We have like we starting from Hellbringer Drake, moving on to the Old Dominion. We have the
mm,
Cataphracti. We have all these like we have Raptor Riders. We have the Apex Predator. We have all
yeah,
everything, all the new stuff that is coming out. I'll tell you what is that designing and manufacturing plastic kits requires a lot of knowledge and a lot of effort,
yeah.
and we are very understanding of the things that we do not know and want to grow, and we invest a lot of resources and a lot of time into learning how to do it better. So that's very important for us to do, and we've managed to get better and better.
So is there any? Obviously, we've seen a lot of bigger kits. Mentioned the Apex Predator, which
Mhm.
is an amazing model. Um, is that something we're likely to see for all the factions then? Kind of big, impressive centerpiece models to kind of add to the collection.
So that's funny. That's funny because there's always this community discussion about when Hundred Kingdoms are gonna get their monster.
Yeah,
They keep. We want to have uh, like centerpiece models for all factions. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're all going to be
yeah,
monsters. Definitely, we want to be able to bring a faction's lore into life through our sculpts
hmm
and give beautiful centerpiece models to every faction, whether that is by having monsters or by having beautifully detailed um, regiments, essentially.
yeah. So I guess for Hundred Kingdoms rather than a monster, ornate-looking cavalry unit maybe makes more sense for them.
Yeah, and the orders are there to be their centerpiece
Yeah.
for sure. Yeah.
Also, I'm excited about them. I do like the Hundred Kingdom. Cool. So if somebody's maybe looking to get into Conquest and has never played it before, they don't know any of the lore, what is the best way for them to maybe kind of get a taste of the game and to learn more about the world?
So um, definitely our website parabellum.com. But even more important is that you can join our Discord. You can join our social media. We have a beautiful program. It's called the Vanguard program, which is our the champions of conquest essentially. They are people that love the game. They love showing the game. They love the world, and they're there to help you in your path to get started. We want to have a Vanguard in every community, and if yours doesn't have one, you're always welcome to join that our community. To learn more, there's definitely a lot of lore on the actual website. You can go through, you can read everything about all factions, you can read about the genesis of the world, and to start getting into, you can find the rules available for free online in PDF. All the army lists, all the rules are available for free, and the starter sets, and then the one-player starter sets, both for Last Argument of Kings, and the tasters for First Blood are a great start. All of the one-player starters for Last Argument of Kings essentially give you a full-on army for First Blood
Hmm.
as well, so you can jump right into.
So we've talked a little bit about First Blood, the kind of skirmish variant.
Mhm.
Can you tell us a little bit about that and who that's aimed at?
So from the very beginning, our goal was to experience conquest from all different, let's say, zoom levels, from
Hmm.
the eyes of a soldier behind the sealed wall, that is First Blood, all the way to board games that take you like develop your kingdom and your empire.
Yeah.
So First Blood is there for players that want to get more into the nitty gritty of it of small scale infantry tactics movement.
Hmm.
We have the opportunity to explore more of each individual models and regiments history and lore. You can find abilities that are a lot closer to the lore. We approach the design of characters a lot differently. We approach the design of officers very differently. They take up a much larger role rather than just being a regiment upgrade. Essentially, you can it's one more way to experience the lore of how these factions experience and navigate the small scale skirmishes of conquest.
No, that's really cool. I'm not giving it. I'm not giving it a go yet. I need to dig into that because there
Mhm.
is an appeal to skirmish battles when maybe you haven't got the time to do a massive, mass ranked battle, but you still want some action in there. Are the rules similar then for people who have played Conquest before?
So the first version of First Blood, it was a lot more similar as
Hmm.
it was we first created to be an easy intro to the game. But with the coming of the second edition of First Blood, we redesigned the entire system and created its own unique skirmish game. So the rules, the underlying concepts are the same. The the same in terms of approach, in terms of
Mm.
thinking, right? But definitely, when you're learning First Blood, you're learning a new system. We're talking about engagement ranges. We're talking about tactical movement of individual models. Models from these different regiments create ad hoc formations. There is merit in having pole arms behind shields as you can attack through. There's all these tactical moves and maneuvers.
Okay,
There's
cool.
command abilities that you can manifest, command ranges, and so on.
That's awesome. No, that sounds cool. So we talked a little bit about Project 8. So with the aftermath of that and all the excitement with the voting, what can players expect to see being the outcome of Project 8?
So, with the voting of Project A, the decision was that the Sorcerer Kings will be the next faction.
Hmm.
So that was a very interesting few quite interesting rounds of voting. We released a lot of visuals for the Sorcerer Kings, and I cannot say a lot more than that. There's a lot of beautiful things coming,
Yeah,
but I can tell you it's official. We have Sorcerer Kings as our next faction.
amazing. That's exciting. Do you guys are you cheering on one faction when you do these things? Was Sorcerer King something you wanted to see released, or was there another one that you maybe wanted to get the
Um,
spotlight?
It's a little different for us because we have the luxury of seeing things play out over a larger period of time.
Yeah,
So we don't necessarily favor one over the other simply because we know we're going to get them all. So,
yeah,
right, we operate, we operate in a different time scale by necessity because of, the time it takes to design and to manufacture things.
yeah.
So, yeah, like it wouldn't be like, oh, we would want this to release over the other, because eventually we want to explore everything and eventually we want to have everything out. So by definition we're going into the long game, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I guess players always want to have more factions and stuff. But considering when did the game launch? 2019. You've managed to bring out a lot of factions in that time, really.
Yeah, that's very true. That's also the reason why we learned a lot, right? We did a lot of work, but it was very important that we move fast because people loved the Hundred Kingdoms, the Spires, the Dragom, the Nords. But to be honest, in order for a war game to be viable,
Mm,
right, you need to have quite a few factions and quite a few things to
yeah,
explore. So we were fully aware of that, and that's why we pushed so hard. But the other thing is that we launched in 2019, right? Launched then, but we've been working on Conquest for quite a few years before that. So there was a lot of work that was already prepared when we started launching.
yeah. I guess one of the downfalls is for some games where there's only those two initial factions, and then people don't find a faction that they fall in love with. So the fact that you've managed to create all this, and then the lore for kind of more around that's really cool. So, what is your favorite faction from the game and why?
So honestly, I will tell you that whatever it is that I'm working at that moment, if that makes
Yeah,
sense,
that makes sense.
right? Because like every time I have to go in deep when so our design philosophy that something needs to play the way it's advertised. So if whatever you read in the lore, we want it to play that way.
Yeah.
This is why it's a game that where you have a character, no matter how powerful the character is, if the regiment they're in dies, they die as well,
Yeah.
because you can never fight a whole army on your own. That's a very
Yeah.
important part of our game design. So every time we're working on designing something for the Last Argument of Kings and First Blood, I have to delve deep into the lore to see, in detail, how does the faction work? What does that
Mm.
faction do? How would those things, how their society, the way the society work, would translate in the way that they fight wars? And when you have to delve so deep into a faction, you create this intimate connection at that point that you really start liking, and you really find this all these cool things that you then take and make into rules.
Awesome.
But I would say I wouldn't. So if I had to choose a faction and say that, I'm really happy with seeing that, regardless of whether I personally would play it or not,
Mm.
but the fact that I see those ideas being manifested on the tabletop, I like seeing the mechanics of the Wadroon, regardless
Yeah.
of whether they would be my first choice or not. I like the city states in the way how fluid they can be, but without how elite they can be without having elite stats.
Yeah.
I like that combination of I like those that concept, right?
Mm.
I like the ability of the Hundred Kingdoms to be the faction that is to bring the right tool at the right time to win.
Yeah.
There's something that I like. There's something that I like in everyone in that way, and it's funny because you know it's not a way to avoid the answer, but it's like when you're creating, it's like you don't see it as creating a single faction, you see it as creating the game, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so
That makes sense.
it's the game that's your favorite game, it's not the faction that is your favorite faction, if that makes sense.
That's a good answer. That's a good answer.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, well, thank you so much for joining us for this interview. Before we let you go, though, we've got a very important question. And we ask it to everybody we interview. What
hmm
is your favourite sprue from the Conquest range, and what is your favourite brew?
My favorite sprue, so let me think. The Brood Drone.
Okay, nice.
And I will tell you why. It's because um, the Brood Drone was the first time we managed to create complicated texture in plastic, and it was a
Mm.
big it was a big achievement for the team, and so that has a lot of
Yeah.
emotional. That was a great win after years of working on that. So it felt great. And my favorite brew, as in beer, you mean?
It's in a beer or a hot drink, whatever your preference.
Oh, okay, okay. So my favorite brew would be Weiser Stefanos Vitus. It's a Weiss beer.
Excellent. Cool. Well, again, thank you so much for coming on. We're going to be looking at some Conquest stuff on the site soon, so hopefully we'll have some battle reports in the near future too, which will be fun. But until next time, have a great time. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you all soon.